You're listening to international investment advisor Doug Goldstein on the Goldstein on Gelt show, the financial show where we'll talk about how you can make the most of your money. With all the confusing financial chatter bombarding you each and every day, Goldstein on Gelt will give you the practical information you want and need about living a financially stable life. Here's your host, money maven Doug Goldstein.
Okay, we are back. We are talking to Jonathan Rowson. He currently leads the Social Brain Project at the Royal Society of Arts, the RSA, in London. Prior to that, he was a professional chess player and teacher and writer, grandmaster since 1999, and he was the British champion for 3 consecutive years, 2004 to 2006. He's written a number of fabulous books, and he's joining us here today. Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
First of all, let me just start by asking you, what is the Social Brain Project?
Well, the quick answer is that we try to think about theories of human nature as they're developing these days quite rapidly through various scientific domains, everything from psychology to neuroscience to anthropology. And we try to use that to think more deeply about practical social problems that the world faces and hopefully to inform public policy in some way. So it begins from the premise that the model we've been working with for years, this model of the rational individual man, is really defunct now. We know it doesn't add up. We know that's not how humans behave. We have our moments of rationality. We have our moments of self-interest. But the richer picture of human beings is one of being largely automatic, profoundly influenced by other people, and often with some concern of doing the right thing, even if that's often quite context-specific. So we try and take all of that and apply it to particular issues of concern.
Wow. So the fact that your study has shown that people aren't so rational, it's a big topic now. We've spoken in the past on this show, in fact, with Dan Ariely, who wrote a couple of books about predictably irrational.
Irrational. Yeah, sure. I know them a little bit. It's a very powerful point because once you confront people with the idea or suggest to people more gently that they may not be as rational as they think they are, and I've done this with chess players who often consider themselves to be the kind of epitome of rationality. But you can show lots of inconsistencies in our thinking and show the ways that we justify things to ourselves after the fact. But in most contexts, really, we're trying to sort of make ends meet. We're trying to make sense of things. We're trying to get rid of confusion in our own minds. But the kind of perceived logic that rationality is supposed to represent is very, very far from most of our day-to-day activities.
Okay, that's a little depressing for someone like me who is my day job is that I'm a financial advisor. I work with people doing financial planning and choosing investments. I'd like to think that the markets and the people would be a little more rational than that. How do you put the two together? Well,
the key is to say that we value certain aspects of rationality. It's important to know what you're trying to achieve and to set out to achieve that. So in financial planning, whether you want to buy a house or whether you're planning to prepare for your children's university fees or whatever it may be, there's definitely a role to be played for conscious, rational thinking ahead and anticipating problems downstream, managing risk and things like that. That's still very important. The point I'm making really is that that's almost like a snapshot out of time. That's the sort of thing we do when we back up and take the system away and kind of rejig it and put it back in play. But while the system's in play in our day-to-day lives, while we're making moment-to-moment decisions about what to buy in the shops and whether to go on holiday or not, it's quite rare that we have that kind of reflective self-awareness that allows us to make really good decisions that are in any sense rational. Most of the time we're just following our impulses or following what other people are doing.
So all of the decisions we make, whether it's what breakfast cereal to eat or where to place our investments, what technique are people generally using, if not rationality, to make these decisions? Just habit?
I wouldn't even call it. Yes, habit's much more like it. I wouldn't even call it a technique. The basic view is that our capacity to reason and reflect is still there. We're not saying it's gone. It's just that it's something that's the exception rather than the rule, something we use to reprogram the system. And the system is mostly habitual and very thoroughly social. So much of what we do when we're taking our day-to-day decisions is following other people, following what we perceive to be normal. And by the way, when you break the word normal down, that's just, norm is right in there. And social norm is really is the main thing that we do. We look around us, see what's normal behavior, and we kind of ape that. And in terms of the degree to which we're conscious, well, I mean, the studies vary a lot, but there's some people who argue that as much as 99% of our activity is unconscious. So it's to say that the rationality is actually quite precious, but it's just not the main thing we do.
Wow. We are talking to Jonathan Rowson, who I'm getting the feeling is claiming that we are more lemmings than people in terms of our rationality. He's the author of 3 books, including the best-selling The 7 Deadly Chess Sins. He's got degrees in philosophy, politics, and economics from Oxford, as well as studied at Harvard. And he is currently leading the Social Brain Project at the Royal Society of Arts. Having been a chess player yourself, it would seem to me as though when you first came across this idea that people are not so rational, you would have shuddered a bit. How did you go from being a rational chess player to someone who realizes that people are more irrational?
Well, I think I was a little unusual in this regard because I can't quite explain why, but from quite a young age, I learned to analyze my own games, as most young aspiring chess players do. And I became really fascinated by my own mistakes. I think many people just, like to, look elsewhere when they see how they've gone wrong. But for me, I was always really intrigued by, what exactly was I thinking? How could I possibly have thought that? And by sort of cross-examining myself and looking in more detail about the kind of moves I'd made and why, I learned a great deal about myself and how my mind works and the kind of assumptions it makes and the kind of, the ways I trick myself into thinking I'm more coherent than I really am. And in this respect, I suppose, subsequently I learned about Jean Piaget, the sort of famous child development psychologist, who said that the key insight into a child's mind is to find out, where they're getting things wrong. It's only really at the point where you see the mistakes that you begin to understand how things are working and where they're misfiring. And so in that way, I suppose, a fascination with error is what got me to this sort of point of view. Because when you start to look at those mistakes, they become really a fascinating kind of leverage point to understand what's going on in your mind. And I think with chess, the wonderful thing is that you cannot help but make mistakes. Whether you're Kasparov or a beginner, the game is so difficult that it's almost impossible to play a whole game without going wrong somewhere.
It sounds to me like your approach is really a very rational approach, meaning let me look at what I did, let me see how to fix it, so I'll do better next time. The opposite, it sounds like you're a very rational guy.
Well, like I say, the key is to see rationality and reason as a sort of tool that we use to reconfigure the automatic social system. There's a place for backing up, and that's the sort of learning process where we come to reflect on who we are and what we do. But what's important to recognize is that that's quite rare. That's the sort of thing that happens, I'm taking a random figure here, but 10% of the time or 1% of the time. Those learning moments are where we back up and say, well, next time the system goes into battle, whether it's in chess or investments or anywhere else, that system will be following certain social impulses, certain automatic impulses. And those impulses, when we bring them to the surface and examine them, we can do that in a kind of rational mode. We can see, are they aligned with our interests? Are they aligned with our objectives? And then if they're not, we try and reconfigure them a little bit. But once we're actually in play, in battle, in our day-to-day lives, the rationality is no longer there. We have to kind of constantly come back to it.
So if we talk nuts and bolts, what people really should do, let's say you're an investor, you come into your investment advisor's office and you say, my goal is that I want to retire in a few years and marry off my kids and buy a new car. So then what tools should that person then use in order to make sure that he's going to get to achieve those goals?
Well, I would say the old sort of advice about savings behavior is spending behavior is quite useful here, because the person may come in and say, I have these goals. The financial advisor will probably say, well, in order to achieve them, you need to save X amount. How are you going to go about doing that? And that's where it becomes difficult, because your access to that X amount depends on how much you're spending on a day-to-day basis. And that's where you're going to struggle, because that's where your habitual behavior is kicking in. That's where you buy the coffee and the donut rather than taking it in from home. That's where you go out for lunch with your friends instead of, again, preparing it. So all the ways that we can save money are a function of our habitual socialized behavior. And it's only really if we can tackle them that we have more money available to save and achieve the longer term things that we want.
So I'm not sure what's new about this concept. Maybe this is where I'm a little lost. For example, when I grew up, we went to the dentist, and then the dentist would say, okay, you have to get in the habit of brushing your teeth in the morning and at night. So it made sense at the time, and he explained it and showed me cavities that hurt. But then I got in the habit. I don't think about it anymore. That's sort of the ideal, is to come up with a rational reason for doing things and then make that part of your habitual practice.
You're absolutely right, Doug. But it's, in a sense, it's not new. Going back to Aristotle and before him, people have been talking about this kind of thing. It's just extremely hard to do it, and the reason we persist in not really doing it, which is, in essence, like you say, having rational objectives, having things you want to achieve, and then going about shaping your life in accordance with them. So that's not. It shouldn't be that difficult, really. But in fact, the reason we don't do it is we carry on with this illusion that we're always rational and that we're always doing things because of our overall goals. But in fact, brushing teeth is one example that we become habituated when we're too young to even be conscious of it. But there are lots of other things, like, for example, exercise. Almost everybody in the world knows they should exercise more and eat better food. But most of us don't manage to do it. And why is that? Because, well, our environments don't really allow us to. One way of framing that is that our habitats, if you like, the habitat being that which forms our habits, is not shaped in such a way that our social and automatic system is allowed to function at its best. Instead, it's shaped in such a way that we're inclined to err and go away from the things that we see as rational.
And you think that's based on the society, or simply based on, donuts taste better than celery?
And they're both, because donuts will always taste better. There are sort of evolutionary reasons why fat and sugar are good for us in a certain context, when we need quick bursts of energy or to, things like that. But that can be mediated by shaping our environment in certain ways. So, for example, if you want to avoid eating donuts, don't walk past a donut stall every day. If you want to start an exercise habit, don't just rely on willpower. Don't just join a gym. Make a pledge to your friends that you'll do it, or make sure that you do some work at the gym every day, so that you find yourself more inclined to go and work out as well. There are lots of ways of doing it. Again, I'm not saying this is revolutionary stuff. All I'm saying is that the focus on it is a bit different, because we tend to think that it's enough to rely on willpower and enough to rely on reason. Uh-huh. But in fact, the influence of our social environment and our physical environment is much more powerful than we think.
I see. A little bit worrisome, but it's certainly a very important idea. We have been talking to Jonathan Rowson, who is currently leading the Social Brain Project at the Royal Society of Arts. He is a former competitive and fabulous chess player, and also an author. He's frequently on the BBC and talking on the radio and TV. And Jonathan, in the last few seconds, could you just tell people how could they follow the work that you're doing?
Well, you can go to the RSA website. That's www.rsa.org.uk, and we're the Social Brain Project here. More generally, I would encourage you just to encourage people to become more self-aware, and that's a very broad objective. But in the process, you come to realize that rationality is important, and so is a power of reason is something to be valued. But just realize it's valued because it's the exception, not the norm, in what we do every day.
Okay, so here's to people achieving the exception sometimes and not just the norm. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt Show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt Show.